Hello again and welcome to Forum for a Better Understanding. You know, it's been 282 weeks in a row that we have been able to bring you this fantastic program from Channel 49, having a chance to show off to the diocese the richness, the depth, and the power of other ways, of other traditions, other faiths. And today we have a guest coming back who hasn't been on in more than a year. And that's a loss to us over the year. But Dr. Grace Schireson, who is a Zen Buddhist priest, is here today to give us some more insight into her own tradition, but also basing herself in today's discussion on her book that is right in front of me as you see it, Zen Women. And I would tell you, be you a man or a woman, be you Buddhist or Catholic, this book is awesome. It has wonderful insights into the power of women in another tradition. And as I read it as a Roman Catholic, it was not foreign to appreciate the tradition that women would be having an uphill climb. That's one nice way to put it. And to know that it's not easy being of a certain type of person to be in a certain form of religion. And we're going to learn from Zen Women through the voice of Dr. Grace Schireson. Grace, I'm so glad you're here today because it's been a long time and you have just celebrated on November 1st a major event in your own life. Before we start the show, tell us about being an abbess and what happened at the Empty Nest Zendo on November 1st.
On November 1st, we had my mountain seat ceremony, which was a very big celebration. Since 1995, I've been here in the Central Valley, sitting on my cushion, doing my meditation, and it's like putting up an invisible flag, hoping that people will join me in meditation for peace and well-being. And little by little, with a few ads here and there, and with your help on TV, we've been gathering a group of people to practice Buddhism together, practice Zen right here in the Valley. That also helps with pollution because people don't have to drive to the Bay Area. Now, you mentioned I hadn't been on your show for a year, and that was because I was finishing my book. But the mountain seat ceremony was a celebration really of this many years. How many years is this in 1995? Almost 15 years.
Boy, that is it, right?
And this is something that the community does for me. It's like a big gala party to say, this is your mountain, and now we have joined you on it, and this is actually a practicing community. So I don't plan it, it's a party that's given for me.
Isn't that nice? And many people gathered from across the valley. I guess one of the sons of your master teacher.
Right.
Tell us about the connection you've had over these many, many years with Japanese Zen Buddhism.
Well, I started in about 1966 with Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. I started meditating with him, and as most people he died in the early 70s. And his son, Hoitsu Suzuki Roshi, has been trying to help stabilize the tradition that he brought across from Japan, and I've gone over to Japan to study with him, and he came over for my mountain seat ceremony with his wife, so it was a big celebration. In fact, Suzuki Shunryu Roshi performed the wedding ceremony for me in 1968 with my husband.
Whom we will meet next week. So if you enjoy this program, stay tuned next week when we'll have a full panel talk about Zen Buddhist priests in the world, the presence of Zen Buddhism through its leaders in this world of ours. Today we wanted to talk a lot about women and their way, but there is also an episode on religion and ethics that I think it does deal with a woman in New York, an architect. But let's see how that gives us something to bounce off of, and also some concepts which, even if we don't develop them in the conversation today, they will be enlightening us all into the power of the Buddhist way in the middle of the confusion of New York City.
And the Jewish people. And this summer, Change Your Mind Day. Every year in New York's Central Park, the Buddhist magazine Tricycle sponsors a demonstration of Buddhist practices called Change Your Mind Day. That refers not to conversion, but to exploring ways to become more mindful, more fully aware, and to meditate. We talked with Jane Smith, an architect, about the kind of Buddhism she practices, Zen.
I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition and loved it. But then when I came to New York, I thought, I've got to figure out a way to be able to handle these stresses that I'm taking on. And so I started thinking, what can I do in order to release the tension and yet still be able to embrace the joy of doing what I really love to do, which is the architecture and the creative skills and the challenge of being in an intense workplace and taking on New York. So I really went on a quest. The Zen practice in the Buddhist tradition is based on nature and space and simplicity. It really was life-changing, mind-changing for me. One of the big differences for me between the two traditions is the idea of how we're born. In the Western tradition, there is the idea of original sin. The Eastern tradition comes from the point of view that we're born perfect, and every moment is really complete and perfect. Now, my practice is part of my day-to-day life. I get up very early in the morning, and I sit for a half an hour with my legs crossed. When you do meditation practice, there's a lot of pain. You're sitting there cross-legged, which is not a Western way of sitting. You look at the pain in the knee and you witness, that's pain in my knee. It's really amazing that as you look at it in this kind of non-judgmental, not clenching around it, freaking out, it starts releasing. And that's the same thing with our thought. Things come up, the stresses that are coming up through the day, but as something comes up, the practice is to allow it to be there, like the clouds that move overhead. The clouds come, you see them, and then they pass away. And so if an anxiety comes up, I look at it, and by looking at it, it diffuses and moves on. And then I have a moment of, and maybe it's a small moment of just peace and relaxation. But it clears my head, it makes me realize again what's important to me in life. Being aware of every sound and everything that's going on around you. And as you do that, you let go of the difference between yourself and the other things out there. You become the sounds on the street. But again, it doesn't last because we're in our human nature. And our human nature is to keep pushing ourselves down and being really tough on ourselves. And I'm big on that one. How do you not be a bystander in your life, but to be an active participant in your life? What I get from Zen Buddhism is the ability to live this life, this moment now, to really appreciate everything as it happens in front of me, and to be able to have the tools to embrace it. That's it for me.
Grace, I've seen this now 4 times, and this Jane Smith is becoming a very interesting person, but you also lit up when you saw the guide that is helping her. Tell us a little bit that we didn't perhaps appreciate of that clip, introducing us to your colleague who was her spiritual master.
Yes, I saw on the clip Pat Enkyo O'Hara, who has a Zen community in the village Zendo in New York. And I've sat with her there and gone to many conferences with her. I really consider her my Dharma sister. In fact, she wrote one of the endorsements on my book, where you see Pat Enkyo O'Hara. And you couldn't see that that was actually a woman because her head was shaved. She does wear her head shaved. I generally wear my hair a little longer, but for my ceremony I had to shave it all off. And this is a traditional connection to the Japanese style. So some people follow it more strictly, and she definitely does. She's also leading a very creative chaplaincy program, which brings me around to the clip. You know, I noticed a couple things about the clip. First of all, a woman talking about just catching a moment in the middle of the stresses of the days. So this is, in my book, I write about the fact that most women don't do religion as a profession. First of all, they haven't been invited to. Secondly, they have a life with family and other responsibilities, and they generally like expressing themselves through doing things in the world, just as you saw her with her hands on her architectural model. And this is what I write about in my book, that was a big difference in the spiritual practice between men and women, not just ideas, but actually doing things, creating images, helping to build little hospitals and pharmacies, providing shelter for abused wives and orphans and so on. And so there was a lot of doing things with the hands and just catching a few moments. This is a woman's day, the way she described it. A woman's day is not, let me devote my day to teaching the Dharma, but let me just catch a few minutes between my helping everybody and doing my work in the world. So the other thing I noticed that is significant to me in the spiritual practice of women in all traditions is what she said, not to be a bystander in your life. You know, Buddhist practice and some religious practices that are aimed at helping men are about men not being too egotistical and full of themselves. Those same practices do not work as effectively for women who tend to stand back and not call attention to themselves. So here she talked about it herself in this clip, which is how not to be a bystander in my life, how to participate. In other words, women are expected to keep the peace, and it's very important they do. In fact, I wish they had a larger role in the world in doing so. But sometimes it's at the expense of themselves and their own aspirations. So one of the things I write about in my book is how it is that doing meditation and centering yourself on yourself can give you a platform from which to actually express yourself. You don't have to sacrifice the peace and harmony to actually bring your voice forward. And I think this is what she was referring to when she said, don't be a bystander in your own life.
You know, we are going to continue this conversation with Grace, not only about this piece that we just saw, which she has helped us really mine and appreciate more than we would have if we just saw it quickly, but we're going to be back and talk about the book, Zen Women, because I'm reading it and I'm finding it fascinating, and I hope that some of you who watch will be able to be in touch with Grace over perhaps purchasing this book and deciding to see how these women from basically Japan, China, India, and Korea throughout centuries have been able to give a legacy of women's living out of the Zen way. I think you're going to enjoy the second half of the program. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
For over 25 years, KNXT has been serving the people of the San Joaquin Valley with good family television that's just not available anywhere else. It's important for you, the viewer, to help support this valuable tool of ministry. KNXT needs to continue to grow and bring you important programming about your faith. But sometimes it's hard to stop and find the time. Make it easy. Go to knxt.tv and find out how easy it is to support your Catholic television station, KNXT TV.
Hello again and welcome back to the second half of our program on Zen Women. We have the author of this wonderful book, the Reverend Dr. Grace Schireson, who recently became an abbess. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up. The very terminology of the nuns, the monks, the abbesses and abbots, it so sounds Catholic because we use those same terms. Could you introduce us, please, Grace, to how this book came to be and how it is that, what is the heart of this book that tells the story of so many interesting women throughout history?
Well, first I have to refer back to a point you made about getting the book. It is on Amazon.com. So people can contact me at my website, emptynestzendo.org, or just Google my name and it'll come up. But I wanted to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book and how it came to be. I started meditating. I always loved religion. I was born into the Jewish tradition, and I loved that too, and I always had a very special feeling when I went to religious services. But at the time that I was growing up, they didn't even do bat mitzvah that much for women, and so when I started meditating and learned how to meditate, I found I could actually enter the practice completely in a different way that was not bound by my gender. So I really took to it, and eventually when I wanted to be ordained as a priest in the tradition, and of course the translations are made to fit our system, so we try to match up amasan, which is nun, or obosan in Japanese, with the English, that's why they're so close to the Catholic ones, because we've done that on purpose to make it recognizable. But when I wanted to be ordained as a priest, I didn't really know. I had no stories about women in my tradition. In fact, we thought in the West that we were the first women to practice Zen so actively. There was nothing in the literature.
Oh,
and what had happened from the time of the Buddha forward is that men and women practiced separately. And because they practiced separately, the men who brought Zen to the West had all trained in male monasteries, and they were bringing forward the practice from the male monasteries. And they didn't have any experience with the nuns' practices or with nuns, because they all practiced separately. And that was dictated at the time of the Buddha, 500 years before Christ. So this is a long tradition. This is the first place in the world that men and women are practicing together. It turns out the women are doing the men's practice and didn't know anything about the women's practices. So as I became ordained, I became very curious about how actually I was going to fulfill my vocation. And so I had the great privilege of traveling in Japan and going to women's convents there and meeting Japanese women who practiced, and began to see that there actually was a long tradition, and I met some scholars, and it was all kind of coincidental. Maybe you could say it was karma, but it became clear to me that I wasn't the only one interested in this, but I was very interested in it just for myself, how to be a priest. So basically what I found out was that the women did have different practices, that they aimed and focused on things that were a little different. And actually these differences are very relevant to Westerners practicing Buddhism now, because the women were not supported financially to the same extent that men were. And because they enjoyed doing projects in the world, because they often had to practice from their homes, there weren't institutions for them. In these ways, this is very much like the Buddhism, the Zen Buddhism that's taking root in the West. It's a lay movement. Most of the people who are practicing Buddhism are not living in institutions, and many of them are married, and they have families, and they have jobs. And this was also the case with the women who oftentimes, even though they may have wanted to practice in an institution, were forced by their families to marry and then took the practice on anyway. So I think these are very important findings for bringing Buddhism another voice and another set of values than the male monastic model that we've had previously.
Now, one thing is just to have you say it clearly. There is no other book like this that has captured from those 4 major countries the legacy of these women. This is a groundbreaking work.
Yes, it is. It's a groundbreaking work and it was my feet and knees that got broken over this ground. I learned to speak Japanese so I could talk to people, and I traveled around, and I even went to Korea, and that was an interesting set of circumstances. One of my friends was going to a scholarly conference in Korea. Otherwise, I might not have included the women in Korea. But because the Japanese tend to, and I'm from a Japanese tradition, the Japanese tend to trace their lineage through China and ignore the Koreans. But when I went to Korea, I really learned historically the practice had come from Korea to Japan. And in fact, the first women ordained in Japan were the first Buddhist ordained people in Japan. They were women, and they were, and that was never taught. And they were ordained by Korean missionaries, and then they went back to Korea. So I felt including the Korean women in this work was a very important part. They have their own flavor. They've been through some very tough times, as we know, even recently with the Korean War. So they have really survived hardship, and they offer so much inspiration. And I think that's really my main message for women is we can have a little bit of a tougher time, but I always look now as I have difficulties, and I think, well, all of my ancestors, all of my spiritual ancestors had these kinds of challenges, and they all, powered through it. And so that's a big inspiration for me.
What about the Indian Buddhist tradition? It's the one we haven't talked about much at all.
Yeah.
Where does that fit into the scheme?
Well, as it turns out, when the Buddha left his home to establish Buddhism, he left his wife, Yashodhara, and his mother, Mahapajapati. Now, his mother actually was his aunt. This was, you know, his father, his biological father, was married to two women, probably more than two women, but one, his mother died at his birth, and the second one was her sister, and she became the queen. Mahapajapati became the queen, and so she was the Buddha's stepmother and his aunt. And so we imagine that he must have had a lot of spiritual inspiration from her. She was a very strong person, as demonstrated later when he left the palace to go on his spiritual quest, and he came back. The women who were waiting for him were his wife and his mother, saying, "We too want to realize what you have realized." And he wasn't ordaining women at that time. So his stepmother, Mahapajapati, who had a lot of power and wealth and position, and it was all at stake for her. She requested several times that he ordain her, and she was refused. And she took 500 women on a walk of 150 miles. They shaved their heads, they put on the robes, even though he said, "You really can't do this." And in the end, he did create a woman's order, and she was the head of the woman's order. Now, at the time that she was the leader of the women's order, he was known as the Buddha, the awakened one, and the feminine form was used for her, the Buddhi, B-U-D-D-H-I, so that we've also lost that from our history, that there was a male and a female regarding the Buddha. So she was a very important figure, and her role and her life and her teachings went on to inspire women wherever Buddhism went, in China, in Korea, and Japan. They all refer to her as the founder, Mahapajapati.
And all of that, in case you're wondering, is in the book, because there's no way to talk about the Zen women without beginning with this wonderful figure, and others will be modeled on her. We find out that certain people seem to have taken on the sort of like manner of this wonderful archetype, this great, great person. Was there something in this writing, Grace, that was your major revelation, that it didn't, you just didn't expect it? It was something that struck you, who know so much about this area. Was it still a surprise? Was there something that was very, very coming from left field to you?
Yes, I think one of the most exciting things for me was how real life these women were, even the centuries away. One of my favorite nuns in the book, Soshini, who went through many hardships, lost her husband and her family and so on, and then went on to become ordained, actually took a position within the harem of the shogun. And this was about the 17th century. And the women were sexual slaves. Now, if we go back to the time of the Buddha, he left his own harem. He was a prince, and he had a harem. That was a custom of the day. And he left his own harem to go out and offer teachings and to find his way in the world. But she went back into the harem, and I thought that that was really a full circle for Buddhism, that she could feel so confident in the teachings that she had to offer, that even in this very difficult, competitive, and even lack of freedom in this, it's called the Ooku, the women's quarters in the shogun's palace, she could take the teachings back in and have something to offer these women. So that was really one of my favorite stories.
It would be a surprise. And then, is there one thing you think would be the most, I guess the best lesson that maybe Christians, who maybe our major audience might be Christians, a lot of Catholics, let's suppose, is there a lesson from the Zen world you think we would best benefit from?
Yes, I think so. I think that women who are devoting themselves so steadfastly to their families and to taking care of everyone they meet need to understand that, as the architect showed us, you need to take some time for yourself. And not to sell yourself short, that there's always more there for you to uncover in yourself and that you will have to offer the world. You know, when I first got the idea for writing this book, it was because one of my students came back from a trip where women were gathering, women in Buddhism were gathering, and she lamented when she was there, there are no books in my tradition. And one of the Buddhist leaders there, Karma Lechet Somo, who's in the Tibetan tradition, said, then you need to write those books. And she said, I don't care if you think you're a terrible writer. That's not an excuse. You have to sit down and write a book if you're a Buddhist woman, or you have to sit down and write if you're a Buddhist woman. And I would say the same thing to Christian women. Don't be a bystander. Dig in and have your say.
There's 2 minutes, which means there's a chance to make, I guess, as they say, a second final thought. What would it be that you would wish that someone who maybe has, what's the biggest change of mind you could give someone about Buddhism to what is a stereotype? What might be one thought that would make us expand so that when we come next week, we'll be ready to learn more? What do we need to come next week with what attitude?
Yes. Well, I think people have this idea, and they constantly criticizing me and holding me up in contrast to the Dalai Lama, who seems like this very peaceful person where I'm more of an active, worldly person. So I think that what people need to understand is like a plant that puts down its roots into its spiritual ground of nourishment, that whatever you are, that's what blossoms. Not some stereotype. You don't become an imitation of some Buddhist model, but you become yourself completely. So I often tell my students, we are not training you to be a doormat. We're training you to really understand what's going on around you, to stand firm on the earth from which you're nourished, your spiritual practice from which you're nourished, and to be yourself. And I think this is a very important lesson for women in all spiritual traditions, because I've heard women say, why isn't religion good for women? If it teaches them to submit more and more and to be doormats more and more, this isn't good for them. And it's not good for anyone.
And what's good for you next week, if you can, is to be here at the same time when Grace will be here with her husband and another Zen Buddhist priest who will be sharing with us their own stories of how they're living out actively their Buddhism in this present world. We'll be here next week. Hope you join us.